Okay, so I've set up my mockup document. 1,000 pixels wide, however many pixels tall. I can always crop it down later on for this sketch. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically lay out my different elements, and I'm going to use layers just so that way I have my different elements on their own layers. I can go back through and save something like my header graphic on its own and drop it into my web page. So I'm kind of building this in a way where I can come back to it and pull the resources that I've created from it and use them in my actual website. So what I'm going to do is just start laying this out. And we've all used the internet before. We all have navigated through websites and seen how the majority of them are laid out. So this is very much just sort of sitting down and sort of blocking things out. So I'm going to give myself different locational areas for stuff like my header. And usually this is how I start out, is I just go through and determine how tall I want something to be, where I want it to be located, just to give myself an idea of what I'm looking for the underlying structure of this. And you guys could do this on paper if you wanted to. I'm a big fan of starting on paper with most stuff to begin with, establishing a grid or some kind or a layout that you can work with from there. So you can see here, and if I'm thinking about this in terms of how we set up our responsive websites that we built with just the colored squares, the divs, here's two 100% width divs that stretch across my web page. If I was going to set up my web page so I had a couple columns laid out, I would do pretty much the same thing. And these blocks of color are mostly just for my own use, where I'm just sort of laying out my grid to get an idea of where I want things to be located. Something like these two here. I can sort of nudge this over and play with how wide that column might be. Just to get an idea of where I want things to be positioned. And I've given it a little bit of a margin here in between the columns, some spacing. And here I'm just going to add a spot for my footer, where stuff like copyright information might go, or something like a designed by, a little bit of text might go, or other elements that you sometimes see. So you can see here, this is a basic grid layout for something like a home page or an interior page. So I've got a header, spot for my header, where this could be a graphic of some kind, name of the website, company logo, etc. An area for navigation, column for content, another column for content. My sidebar might contain something like useful links, or maybe a small image of some kind, or a brief biography with a link that says, read more here. And then I've got my footer, where it would be information like, this site and content is copyright 2015, name of the site, or designed by, or you could even put something like citations for resources down there as well, if this was something like a scholarly or a thesis website project of some kind. And then what I'd like to do is sort of name these in a way that I know what they are. And once I've got that set up, and I've got an idea of what my underlying structure is for my web page, I can now go through and start to actually design this and make some changes to reflect what I want my web page to look like. So I'm just going to save this quick. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and actually start adding content that's going to make this look like a web page. It's not going to be an actual website, but this is what I'm going to use to sort of aim for when I'm building my site. So I'm going to do a quick search for some resources. Wright Brothers Airplane. Under search tools in Google image search, there's a little box where if you click it, it expands. And under usage rights, try to use stuff that's labeled for reuse with modification or reuse. And that's just so that way we avoid any sort of copyright infringement issues there. We talked a bit about that, at least in my CART 101 class, and we'll probably have another discussion about that in here at some point as well. So I'm just going to go through and find something that looks pretty good. I think I like the look of, oh, that one's a little grainy. Let's grab this one. And at this point, this is just very much a creative exercise. So it's going to be just sort of going through, define your space, set up your grid, and then from there go through and start playing with the design aspects of this. And I've stopped talking because I'm going to end up switching over to the other side of my brain and actually creating stuff, so I'll leave that. But you get the idea. Basically, you're going to lay out what the structure looks like. Then you're going to define, okay, what are my navigational elements? What buttons are they going to need? They're going to need a home button. They're going to need a link to any other pages. So you could drop that in, decide what the text looks like. You know, what do you want in your left column? What do you want in your right column? Things like that. What are the colors going to be? The colors that I used here were just to drop in and sort of divide up my space so I could get an idea of where things were located. You can play with the height on things, the widths, all that stuff. Be aware as you're designing as well. Designing for the web is not like designing for print or fine art in any way. So what you really want to try and avoid is, we can do stuff like overlapping, say the tip of this wing over top of the navigational bar. But for what we're trying to do here in this class as an intro to web class is focus on the basics of building clean, efficient designs that communicate whatever message that they are meant to communicate. So as you're going about this, think in terms of using a grid of some kind, using negative space, using white space to divide up the separate elements, things like that. A lot of, like, if some of you have taken graphics design with Kathy, a lot of what we do in here sort of plays on those same principles and those same concepts. Does anyone have any questions as to what we're doing here? Yeah.
I just wanted to know, is there a difference, if you use Photoshop or Illustrator, the process after you make your page layout? Is there a difference?
Not really. You can use Illustrator to mock this up if you like. Photoshop, I use Photoshop just because, you know, I may start playing around with this image and altering it in some way to create the graphic for my header. And by doing that in Photoshop, it's easier to work with the raster graphics in Photoshop to begin with. If I like the way it looks for my mockup, I can basically take it, save it out on its own, and then use that in the actual website. I won't have to try and recreate it. So if you're working with like photographic stuff like this, you can use Photoshop, or if you want to do stuff entirely with vector graphics, you could use Illustrator as well. Either one will suit the purpose.
Does it matter like if you use Illustrator and pick the photographs?
No. Yeah, as long as you're saving, you know, save those resources somewhere so if you need to get back to them and work with them again, make sure you just hang on to them so that way they're somewhere where you can get access to them. Yep. Okay. Anybody have any other questions? Yeah.
How did you get the picture?
Just from the internet.
Well, but how did you
Dropping
get
it
the
into Photoshop. I basically right-clicked on my image, hit copy image, and then pasted it in. Or you can save the image to your desktop and then pop that open in Photoshop from there.
But this one right
On your keyboard, if you hold down Control, it'll let you right-click. Yeah, these mice are awful, in my opinion.
Or you can change it on your settings.
Yeah, you could go to Preferences for the mouse as well and set it up through there.